Number 1.
It's been almost 2 years since the incident, so I'll try to recount the events the best I can, though I've tried to forget about it since. Just a heads up, to anyone who doesn't cope well in long, narrow spaces, I wouldn't recommend working at the kind of establishment in which this story takes place. After graduating university, I had spent nearly a whole year applying for jobs in the media industry, specifically film and television based. I had almost given up hope, until one day my mom informed me that there would be field engineers required to work evening shifts for a period of 2 to 3 months at the firm that she worked at, and that they needed applicants. I was slightly skeptical about it at first, seeing as I had no previous experience in IT and computer science, and it wasn't exactly my desired industry field. But she assured me that it would be manual handling, such as removing and replacing cables, and that I should go ahead and send in my resume. It sounded simple enough, plus the hourly pay rate was too good to be true. As well as that, I could keep applying for immediate jobs while earning some green. It all seemed logical at this stage, so without hesitation I applied. 3 weeks later I was fortunate enough to be accepted and commenced my 2 8-hour day work shifts a week. It started out pretty well, accessing the data hall to check the wiring frames and handling cables. Very easygoing work. The data hall itself could be slightly unsettling at times though. The overhead lights in each aisle were motion censored and would go out every 5 minutes or so depending on your proximity, leaving nothing but patches of pure blackness. You could also become so accustomed to the sound of the AC that you would eventually drown it out, making noises from elsewhere more apparent. Plus you would get the occasional jolt from walking into someone in the halls. This didn't bother me so much in the beginning. Being a horror movie enthusiast, it takes some doing to scare me. However, about a month into the job, things began to get very eerie. I was working one of the night shifts with Mick, a fellow colleague. Mick was a pretty decent guy, a family man in his late 40s, early 50s, tall and very easy to get along with. It would be fair to say that when we were working together I felt very safe. He had to shoot off early as he had kids to look after. I assured him that I would be fine all by myself, and that I had enough to keep myself occupied for the remaining time. About 15 minutes after Mick left the hall, I was plucking away at some wiring frames when I began to hear a strange noise coming from the dark far end of the hall. I can make it out to be something between a footstep and a trot, awkwardly paced. I turned my head in the direction of the noise before calling out, "Mick? Mick, is that you?" There was no response. By this time the sound had ceased. I put down the cables I was holding, got out my pocket torch, and made my way over to the far corner, the lights above illuminating the path behind me. When I got to the far end, I found nothing. There was no sign of anybody having been there. Despite the baffling nature of the situation, I shrugged it off and called it a night. The following week, I was back into work. I was informed by Carl, the security guard, that Mick would not be in this week due to family matters, and that I would be working solo. It kinda came across as sketchy at first, but I trusted his word and went on with my shift. I would say I spent a solid 4 hours in the data hall. It was during that 4 hours that I heard a familiar sound coming from the far end of the nearby aisle. It was the trotting foot noise. What followed next was even more unnerving. I can only describe it as a low, almost demonic baritone purr. What the fuck? I thought to myself. I slowly and quietly crept over to the aisle, with my torch in hand, and a shiver creeping down my spine. Once I got to the aisle, I peeked around the corner to see what was down on the other end. There was only blackness, until I turned the torch on and raised it up to reveal something shocking. What I saw, if only for a half second, was a pair of thin hind legs. The shiver in my spine suddenly intensified before the legs walked off to the side and out of sight. There wasn't time for me to make out much more than that. I proceeded to power walk, then jog down the aisle, with the lights above illuminating behind me. I got to the end of the aisle, but I found nothing. In a state of overwhelming perplexity, I made my way to the security office and knocked on the door. Carl opened up, and with a slight look of concern on his face, he asked me,
"Hey man, everything alright? Is something wrong?"
"Carl, listen, has anybody else been in the data hall apart from me? Because I'm sure I saw someone or something in there with me," I replied nervously.
No. I've been looking at these monitors all this time, and nobody else has gone in or come out of there."
I spent the rest of the day up in the main offices trying to calm my nerves. On the drive home, I had many questions racing through my mind. What exactly was it I saw? Was it my imagination? Was it real? If so, then why would such a creature be roaming in such a technological environment? And if it was in fact real, why weren't the lights above illuminating it? It just didn't make any sense. I wish I could tell you it ended there, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Against my better judgment, I decided to work the next shift. It may have seemed unwise at the time, but I needed every penny I could earn. Plus, it was the last shift of the working week, and I would have several days off to relax afterwards. I wish I hadn't gone that night. Despite what I had seen prior, I was not prepared for what was to come. I would be working solo again, as Mick was still away on family matters. Upon entering the data hall, I had a thought. If I was going to be working alone, I wanted as much light as I could get. I started roaming each aisle from my end, figuring I would get enough light to last me maybe 15 to 20 minutes until the next lap. But then, after not even getting a quarter of the way around, a sudden realization set in. From that point on, none of the lights would come on. I was both shocked and confused now. After a couple of minutes of pondering, I foolishly brushed it off and went about untangling cables on one of the corner frames, as there was just enough light there in order for me to work. A solid hour had gone by at this point, and things seemed to be going okay, despite the lack of light. However, only a few moments later, my ears picked up a most disturbing sound, an all too familiar one. I felt it like a punch in the gut. It was the demonic purring and trotting noise, coming from the far end of the hall, only louder this time. I hugged the wiring frame while shaking in fear. What I saw next will haunt me until the day I'm dead and buried. Stupidly, out of morbid curiosity, I stuck my head to the side of the frame, and I saw something standing at the far corner of the outer aisle. Standing there, in the near darkness, was the silhouette of a figure, with those thin hind legs, a broad, muscular upper body, and a pair of glowing red eyes, staring directly at me. It felt like an anvil had dropped and crushed my rib cage, as I just stood, frozen stiff. Then after a few seconds, the creature began to approach me with trembling steps. I was unable to move at that moment, as I was still frozen with fear. The creature could only make it halfway before I finally snapped out of it, bolted through the hall, down the corridor, past the security office, and out of the front doors. I hopped furiously into my car, started up the engine, and drove home like a man with nothing to lose. My mom was still up by the time I got home. She immediately noticed a look of trepidation on my face and began to fear the worst as I staggered my way inside. I told her everything, and she gradually calmed me down, telling me that she would look into it come morning. The following day came after seemingly endless hours without sleep, and we were once again informed by Carl that I was the only person working in the hall that night. Still feeling unnerved over this ordeal, I decided that day to throw in the towel and quit my job at the firm. There was no way in hell I was going back there again. I have since been fortunate enough to get a job as a sound engineer for a local production company, and I've undergone some counseling at the request of my mother. I enjoy the work I do now, and the atmosphere is refreshingly pleasant. The supposed hallucinations have ceased for some time now. To this day, the meaning behind the incident remains unclear. Then again, I guess some things are best left that way.
Number 2.
This is a story about a culmination of events that happened over the course of almost a decade, from when I was a small child to the present day. It is without a doubt the most unnerving thing that's ever happened to me. It started right after we moved to the countryside of Afton, Oklahoma. Afton is so small that it's barely big enough to be on the weather map. I lived for most of the year with my mother and stepfather, but during the summer and every other weekend, I would spend with my biological father. The house was on a hill, as was our neighbors, and my grandparents were just up the road. That area was called Horse Creek, and there was a legend surrounding it that a tribe of Indians was living on that land in the mid-1800s. A group of settlers wanted to take control of the land, so they sectioned off a bit and went in to find it inhabited by the Indians, and they decided just to kill them all. They sent the cavalry to secure the village and force the warriors upstream. They positioned riflemen to pick them off one by one. They shot them in the creek like animals, and the horses continued to run upstream until the waters rose too high and they drowned, trying to escape. When I was little, I remember seeing a very tall man, or a shadow of a man, in the woods by the house. Whenever I would look at it, it would hide behind a tree. This went on for a few years. I got older, and I would hear whispers sometimes that would pierce the air. I always brushed it off as me hearing things. My father eventually took up a job at a wellness center about 30 minutes away, leaving me alone for most, if not all, of the morning. One day we looked out our bedroom window that overlooked the pasture down at the bottom of the ridge, and we saw a coyote, but it was walking very strangely. It stumbled but kept at a steady pace, not slowing down at all. And it was in the middle of the day. Most coyotes come out at night to hunt, but not this one. We took out a pair of binoculars to get a closer look. Then, I kid you not, it started galloping into the trees like some kind of horse. Sometimes I would be outside, and I would hear 3 sharp whistles that I assumed were birds. But after doing some research, I determined that there was no type of bird that could have made such a noise. Sometimes I would hear this terrifying screech out from the hills. It pierced the air, and it felt like a knife in your eardrum. I always used to think that it was some kind of animal, but again, in retrospect, no animal could have made that noise. We would go camping occasionally by the creek, and I would always feel like we were being watched. One night I went to relieve myself up at the edge of the woods by the clearing, and when I finished I heard a branch snap nearby. Only 2 things were capable of snapping branches: large animals or people. I heard loud thuds like footsteps, heavy footsteps, and quietly went back to the campsite. But the most disturbing encounter was one night a few years ago. We were driving home on a clear night, shortly after sunset, and a fog swept across the road. Then something dashed across the street. It was at least 7 foot tall. It had spikes running up and down its back, slender limbs. It had large hands and long claws, and moved in a slouched position. When our headlights hit it, it took 2 strides to get across the road, and a third to bound over the ditch and barbed wire fencing, and disappeared on the other side. The next day my father left, and I went outside to go check the dogs. There was a tall figure standing at our mailbox at the top of the hill. I thought I was seeing things. It went away a few hours later. The next day we checked the mailbox, and in the dirt, we noticed what appeared to be an enormous clawed handprint. We moved away a few years ago. I'm not certain about anything, but after hearing more stories and accounts, I think that the creature we saw was a skinwalker. I'm glad we don't live there anymore. That's my story, and I'm terrified just thinking about it. And I'm always wondering why it never hunted us down, but I think whatever higher power may be looking over me, it didn't.
Number 3.
I know most scary stories tend to happen in the dark, but mine takes place in the daylight. I know how this sounds, but there's some kind of thing that resembles an animal, but clearly is not, and it's stalking our woods. And nobody in town believes me. Yesterday at 5 a.m., I woke up and went for a jog. I started up a quiet back road surrounded by trees, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something running alongside me, right inside the tree line, and I glanced over at it. This thing looked to be almost 7 feet tall, judging by the height of the surrounding branches. But that made absolutely no sense to me, that such a tall thing could keep pace with me through the undergrowth and barely make any noise. It was completely hairless and abnormally thin, and had pale skin. It made eye contact with me, and I saw its piercing, unblinking blue eyes, and I immediately started running as fast as I could back towards my house without looking back. I was convinced that this thing was hauling ass right behind me. When I arrived back at my house, I sprinted up through the backyard and into my kitchen through the back door, and it suddenly occurred to me that I shouldn't have returned to my own house, because now it knows where to find me. My heart was racing and I still felt paranoid. I could still feel its eyes on me from the shadows outside. I tried to calm myself down, but the uncomfortable sensation of being watched wouldn't stop. So I called a friend at 6 in the morning to pick me up and take me anywhere, as long as it was away from my house. My family was actually on good terms with the mayor of the town. So after my friend picked me up, I made the stupid mistake of calling him out of sheer panic, without any kind of proof whatsoever. I didn't get directly through to him, but left a very winded, terrified, and pleading message on his voicemail. I was later informed that he was furious at me for abusing my knowledge of his private number and forbade me from ever calling him again. Of course, he didn't believe me, but I doubt he actually took a moment to even consider what I was saying. I've decided that tonight, 3 of my friends and I are going to arm ourselves and go out into the woods where I saw this creature and show everyone that I'm not a liar or crazy. It's not just me either. I live in a part of New York where people have claimed to see this thing lurking around in the woods and dark alleys, but no one pays attention to the claims or bothers to investigate. We're going to find this thing, and we are going to bring back proof. If no one hears from me again, it doesn't mean that we couldn't find it. It just means that this time, we couldn't outrun it.
There's always a reason to be afraid.